Welcome to Making Sense of AI, where we unravel the complexities of artificial intelligence, exploring its profound impact on our world. In each episode, we delve into the tension and promise of this transformative technology, seeking to uncover how AI is reshaping ethics, business, education, and beyond. Join us as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of the AI revolution, offering a hopeful vision for the future. Brought to you by Turner and Binova AI. Today, we are thrilled to have with us Alix Rübsaam, VP of Research, Expertise, and Knowledge at Singularity University. Alix is a renowned expert in AI and ethics. With a deep understanding of ethics in AI and the philosophy of technology, Alix brings a unique perspective to our conversation. She has been at the forefront of research on the societal and cultural impact of exponential technologies. And today, we will explore the evolution of ethics and AI and hidden algorithmic biases. Please welcome Alix to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jos.
Well, our friendship and our working relationship goes back, I think, 8 years now, 7. That's what it feels like. But I know you've been active in this incredible space of exponential technologies, philosophy, the ethics of AI for far longer than that. Actually, I would consider you a pioneer in this field in the Netherlands, but globally, actually. So can you tell us a little bit, Alix, why this space and what have you noticed in the last while that you think is very important for our listeners to know when it comes to AI and ethics?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for that question. It's fun to reflect on certainly the last, I would say, decade of this area. So my research has always been in responsible AI. I would say 10, 12 years ago, it wasn't even called that, really. And so my original research was in cultural analysis, so really studying cultural artifacts in relation to specific sort of like concepts or approaches or methodologies. And I started in my postgraduate work looking at specific ways in which technologies were either represented both fictionally and actually, and researching them on the sort of merit of their impact they have on how we position ourselves, how we position those technologies in our society, in our cultures, etc. And so that's really how I got into this field. And it's been interesting. So one of the core things I've been researching has always been, how do we translate, right, the world as we know it, which is made up of messy reality that we understand partially, but certainly not totally. How do we translate that world, our realities, our my perceived reality, which is different from your perceived reality, our actual reality, which we may or may not have fully access to? How do we translate all of that into a digital, data-driven representation? Because our computer systems can only, interact with very specific kinds of information, which is ultimately, at its core, binary data. And there's a translation there that happens, which we're getting increasingly good at. If you look at the last 10 years, the ways in which we're able to capture data, which is really this convergence of sensors of where we get our data, whether it's structured data, whether it's unstructured data, the explosion of just a sheer amount of information that's represented digitally has been, fueling all of our artificially intelligent systems. And so my initial research has always been really on what happens in that moment, if you will, where our real world gets translated and represented into data points that our computer systems can deal with. So that has been my entry point for the research I've done over the last decade, or I think, as you rightly call out, it's about a decade and a half now. And practically what that looks like is really thinking about, if we have computer systems that we are tasking with decisions that they need to make, as we see in a lot of machine learning, as well as now in what we see with generative AI, do we feel like those computer systems have all the information or have the correct information that they need in order to make those decisions as well as we would want them to, right? To give a really concrete example, what we know in machine learning, especially in automated decision, as we've seen in hiring, right? For example, but also if you think about college application systems or other selection criteria that have been automated, is we often give a computer system a number of examples of the decision we wanted to make, right? And that can even be as simple as the first visual machine learning algorithms that just had to learn whether they could recognize a cat, right? If you remember those really early machine learning systems that were trained to recognize cats in pictures. And so the way you do that is really by just giving it a load of examples of, in that case, tagged photos that say, this is a cat, this is not a cat. And by giving it those examples, you train it to recognize what a cat looks like. And the same we do in hiring mechanism. You might feed an AI historical hiring decisions and train it to replicate those, whatever it is that you're hiring for. The same happens with college applications. You might show it, here are some of the criteria that we want. And so all of those examples, right, and many of the other examples that we've seen over the last years really rely on the quality of the representation of the real world decisions that we make, that we give our computers. And this is, of course, also where we've seen this at times go wrong, and where we've seen things have really negative effects on how well and how fair and how equitable these systems work. So that's been a research area of mine for a long time now. What's really fascinating is that back in, I want to say 2014, when I first started publishing on this was a topic that wasn't really top of mind for anyone, right? This was something that was, at the time, we were seeing really big strides in machine learning, super high, and it was a very exciting time, right? It was either 2014 or 15. That was the first time machine learning algorithm was better at visually identifying images than a human was. So humans operated at an average of about 95%, I think. And it was the first time that a machine learning algorithm was better at recognizing what was in a visual data set. It was, I think, at 97%. So this was a time when everyone was really looking at like, well, these are incredibly advanced. And they were incredible advances, to be clear. But my research always focused on, well, what gets left behind in those translations? What might we miss? In 2015 is when I think it was the first time that Amazon had they had trained in-house on their own data this hiring algorithm that had learned from their historic hiring decisions. And it turned out when they deployed this algorithm in the wild or on new hires, that this algorithm had a huge bias towards men because of the data set that it was trained on, but because there had been a historic bias towards hiring men in Amazon's data set, their machine learning algorithm also had replicated this bias. And so we saw the first sort of instances of where this started to go wrong. There was another very famous example of facial recognition software in cameras, but I forget the brand. It was a big camera brand that had automatic face detection, which we now all have on our cell phones, right? If you take a photo, you see that little square on your camera that detects wearer faces. And so this was, I think in 2016, this was fairly new. And so there was a camera that wouldn't recognize the presence of a face if the face wasn't white, or if it had Asian features, East Asian features. It would ask whether someone was blinking because of different shape of eyes more predominant in faces there. And so what we saw is that there was a data set that was overtrained on white faces and undertrained on not white faces. Later in 2018, research done by Joy Bulamwini she dove deeper into this subject, and she did an intersectional analysis across different facial recognition software. But back in 2016, this went like slightly viral because of this particular camera that didn't recognize faces if they weren't white, which again, you can see with problems in the data set. And so at the time, this was now and then you would hear of an example where this went wrong, but there wasn't really widespread understanding of why this might happen. And we can go deeper into like the whys this might happen. The data set is one issue. How you set the problem is another issue. And really how you scale up your systems is another area in which this can go wrong, which even would go wrong if you have a fully representative data set. But what was fascinating for me is that, you know, a lot has changed in just the last 5 years. I remember distinctly this was June 2019, when Microsoft, who had themselves a famous example, they had this chatbot they released on the internet called Tay that they put on Twitter. And it was hilarious because this chatbot, they said that it would be a good idea that the chatbot would just learn from its interactions with people on Twitter. I think it's such a telling example. Of course, this went horribly wrong, right? This chatbot started spewing the most problematic stuff within 24 hours. And I think they had to take it offline within 36 hours because of how bad it had gotten. And it's a great indication of what I would call a lack of representation in what are we trying to do and how are we trying to solve for what we're trying to do. I imagine that the experience of the people who program Tay have on Twitter is very different than what we know is the experience of many other people on Twitter, where they're constantly barraged by trolls. And so the people who made or came up with the idea of Tay would have had an experience of the internet that is fairly limited relative to the experience of everyone on the internet. And so especially in 2017. So what was fascinating is in June of 2019, Microsoft released their year stakeholder report. And it was, to my knowledge, the first stakeholder report where I saw responsible AI as a risk, not just to the business, because ultimately, of course, if your AI isn't working as you want it to work, it will decrease the applicability of your system. But it was listed as a risk under the brand and reputational damage list. And this was, I think, an interesting turning point, because any engineer that programs AI understands that any model has its limitations, right? And a good engineer will always be able to tell you, here's where the model performs well, here's where it doesn't perform well, here's where I think we should use it, here's where I don't think we should use it. I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding. Like, a good engineer will know that. What I found in my work is that most people that get to work on these systems aren't empowered to speak up about what they think these limitations are. They're just given sort of like, I need an AI that does this, or I need a model that does this for me. And it will not be positioned to really, really say, well, here are its strengths and here are its weaknesses. Whereas any good engineer, I would say, usually knows exactly where those are. But what was interesting about this instance of Microsoft releasing this risk report was that it shows that if there's risk of reputational or brand damage, that told me there is a shift in how the public engages with automations that big companies or any company really bring out, right? Because if the public isn't aware of certain inequities that can be perpetuated by AI, or by certain unfairnesses that can be perpetuated by AI, then you wouldn't run any reputational risk. So to me, 2019 was really a turning point where we saw that there was broader awareness culturally and societally around what the potential risks and potential irresponsibilities were that these AIs could perpetuate. And so the last 5 years have been fascinating in that regard, right? It's been really encouraging to see increasing awareness about how we can be more responsible with our AIs, how we can be more thoughtful about where we deploy them and where we don't automate, right? Because some things we may not want to automate. And especially now with the proliferation of generative AI, I see many people really problematizing. You know, I remember last year when we had so many new generative AI, specifically also in visual imagery, right, in image generation, and people really testing the limits of what they thought would be right and good applications for this. So I remember a post that was made on Reddit by someone who had asked 6 different image generators. And you might remember this because in the early days of image generation, it really, or not really the early days, but early public days of image generation, these AIs really struggled with the right amount of fingers that should be on someone's hand. You might remember seeing like these really, right? There was all like 7 fingers or 3. And I remember a Reddit post that I regret not saving because I would have shown it everywhere, was this post around someone had asked 6 different images to be generated. And they had, I think, an average of 4.5 fingers, so close to correct, but certainly not. But all of them, it had just asked to generate a picture of a hand holding a water bottle. All of them were white hands, and most of them were also clearly male, right? And so I believe generative AI has also become a tool with which we can really discern this default whiteness and this default maleness that's still perpetuates our data sets and still perpetuates our problem setting. And so I think that's a really exciting shift, right? Sure, there's also still all these issues, but to me, the most interesting opportunities lie in how we can collaborate with these automated systems in order to really actually address some of these biases. Because the thing is, these biases, these unrepresentative ways in which our AIs replicate the world around us, they're not coming from the AI, right? They're coming from the data sets that we've fed them. They're coming from the problem setting that we've given them. And so we're making explicit a lot of issues that we have anyways. And so I'm excited about figuring out a way in which we can use these systems to address those issues more and make them more visible, right? I'm reminded of one of the issues we saw with many of the standardized tests, certainly in the US, but other places as well. I think it was the SATs at the time, where when you have like a question around sort of like so-and-so goes to the supermarket and they buy 16 watermelons and the watermelons are priced at like three for the price of two, etc. When you have like a story-based assignment like that, because in the SATs, all the stories were instances or let's say occurrences that would happen more to a specific subset of society, right? Specifically white, educated, privileged, affluent groups of people. So the stories that were told were much more familiar to them, to those people, than they would be to people that don't have those backgrounds. And so as such, people who come from a different background would then have to take an additional hurdle in order to understand even what that story was about before they could even get to answering the actual question that was at hand. And so this was found to have a disproportionate effect really on how well people performed in these standardized tests.
I think that's wonderful that you say that, because I think as a person who thinks primarily in English but has worked all over the world and ended up being back in the Netherlands, which is, also, I guess, in some way my home country, but always that translation that has to happen.
Yes.
And my concern is when you said a couple of really interesting things. You said the conversions of the senses. Then you also, and this was earlier on, and you also mentioned what is getting lost. And my concerns, and I'd love it if you could address this a little bit, is yes, we're aware of the biases. The cases you mentioned, absolutely. I'm glad you brought, you reminded our audience of them. But what is getting lost, Alix? And we know so many stories are getting lost. And we know that because it's a race right now, you and I both spend a lot of time in California. It's a war/race to carve out space in this somewhat black box of imaginary AI land, if you will. It's still this repetition of a colonialization of the data or the models or what we want to perpetuate in our narratives. So Alix, what is getting lost and how concerned should we be about that?
I would say fairly concerned. I'm fairly concerned. I think one of the biggest risks that I believe we face is this immense homogenization, right? What I believe is the biggest risk of being lost is nuance and different realities. Your reality is different than mine. My reality is different than others. And there are some things we might agree on, but my perception or my experience of that would still be different. Let me put it this way. What I think everyone right now is trying to do with AI is to make this sort of like universally true hyper machine. And that I would really caution us against. We can do incredible things with AI. The most powerful applications that I see are localized. They are constrained either temporally, contextually, or conceptually constrained. And so what I mean by that is anyone that knows enough about AI understand, and history, I suppose, would understand this is a silly suggestion. But I once had a conversation with this guy. This was like the typical Silicon Valley tech believer, right? He said, well, why don't we just feed all of history to an AI and then it can make all these decisions for us? And that should really give us pause, right? History is written per definition, and as such is per definition situated. And I think that's an overarching example of the problem that I think we're currently facing in AI and what we're currently at risk of losing. To give an example is if I have, let's say, a self-driving vehicle, right? And I've trained it here on the streets of Amsterdam, And it performs really well here. It performs better than human drivers in every possible way. So I get ambitious and I say, let's deploy this self-driving vehicle. I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to plop it into New Delhi and I'm going to put it in Los Angeles. And every one of us would say, well, let's do some additional training, shall we? Because we, as humans, all understand we have contextual awareness that the streets of Amsterdam as training ground are not representative for the highways of Los Angeles or the chaos of, well, I mean, Amsterdam has its own chaos, to be clear, of the streets of New Delhi, because we understand there is a gap there, right? And so I would understand, I can say, I can test how well a self-driving vehicle drives in the cities of Amsterdam, not being sufficient for it to be then deployed in other contexts. And so what I'm excited by, right, in this context is how specific we can be with the AI applications that we have. I've seen excellent examples of this being used, especially in, I think when people are involved, it gets to be sort of like trickier. But think of industrial applications, right? If you have a manufacturing site where you just have to make sure you can run a bunch of simulations or you can run a bunch of experiments on like what temperature is ideal, and you can have machine learning help you with what would be parameters of specific modes of production contingent on the temperature that your site has to make it very specific. We also see this in biotechnology, right? For example, in drug discovery is thinking about, okay, we have all these compounds that interact with each other in a specific way. What else could we experiment with in terms of medical applications? Now, with medical applications, of course, it becomes tricky because we know that not everyone works the same. So drugs may not work for everyone in the same way. And we know that there are massive data gaps in, again, really any sort of like data set that isn't white and male, right? Up until very recently, all drugs were only tested on men because women having a menopausal cycle made that it was harder to isolate, like in true sort of like scientific experiments, right? You want all variables to be the same except for the drug that you're testing in this case. And so because women have a menstrual cycle, it was harder to isolate the data, right? Because there's other factors that might impact how a woman's body is functioning. And as such, they were just taken out of the data set because it was simply too hard or too costly or too complicated to test drugs, meaning that all drugs that we use today, all medicine, are tested predominantly on men. So there's a translation there, even within sort of like biotechnology, that I would say we have to be careful of sort of like what gaps we have. There's a lot of interesting things we can do with AI. But what's important is that we all, and what we are at risk of losing, right, is say I make an AI generated curriculum for school, that might be great in the instance where I've designed it because I've come to that with all the contextual awareness that I have, with all the contextual information that I have. But what I would warn us against is then to say, okay, let's make this particular curriculum that I have developed with an AI for this particular context. Now let's implement that across the entire country, or let's implement that across the entire world, because then we're running into the same thing, same example as with the self-driving vehicle. It's like, it doesn't work that way. Right? There's nuances, there's differences that are localized, that might be temporal, that might be situational. And so the best thing we could do is to use AI in those kinds of specific instances. The worst thing I think we could do is to assume that we build systems that apply everywhere, that apply always, that apply for everyone.
Well, and here's the thing. We have that race going on, carving out that space, which nobody owns yet. But again, we do see that the power of the decision making or the speed of the ability to build the models. You and I know that even the funding environment for artificial intelligence startups or companies is completely different in Europe and North America. And then if we have to start thinking about the African continent, for example, for me, this point in time, especially when it comes to education, we really have two routes we can take. We can focus on that consistent enabling and always being mindful of what we're missing. But Alix, how would you think about the fact that we can't be what we can't see? And this goes back to that example you gave of the conversation you had with the person in Silicon Valley who said, well, why don't we just feed it history and then let it, make its own decisions? Well, because history, the way in which we've recorded, also records about 10% of what has actually happened in a very biased way. So
Yes.
my worry is a little bit that we're already working with a completely biased data set, and undoing that is a whole other challenge. So how do we go about something like that?
Well, this is where I think it's crucial for us to be, not just to be ourselves, but to train and to educate people to be critical users, right? That's the only superpower that we have against, and it really is quite a superpower because we're actually really good at that if we train for it.
How do we train people to be super critical users?
Well, there's two things. The subversion that we would have to do as users anyways, like pushing back, etc. I think there's a telling example. When I lived in the US, I had a roommate who was American, and they had what's it called? The Amazon Alexa. They had an Alexa, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because it was theirs, it was set to American. And this Alexa, with my accent, it would not hear me. So I would either have to ask my roommate when the Alexa alarm for something was going off, like, can you get it to stop? Or I would have to go, Alexa, stop, so that she could actually hear me and understand the thing I was trying to do. Now, to me, that's a sort of like really small example of the risk that we run of that we start adapting ourselves to the technology rather than it to us, right? To our specificities. So that's one thing I always encourage people is to really think about, okay, how are we changing ourselves? The way that we Google things, right? The way that we talk to Google or that we talk to ChatGPT is not how I talk to people. It's like you understand enough of the technology to know how to get the best results. And so you adapt yourself in how you query. And this is where I think we can subvert by being very mindful of how we do that and what we, therefore, get lost in our translation and how we do that.
Well, so it really is about how critically are we assessing the relationship and the way in which we communicate with our technology.
Yes. If I'm talking to Alexa and I have to fake an American accent, I have to be mindful of that I'm doing that, right? That's one thing. I mean, the technology is forcing us to do that. And I would also encourage sort of us to think about like all of these universally applicable things that really aren't universally applicable. And for us to think about, for creators to think about, what am I asking my users to leave behind of themselves? But really at a critical user level, we also have to think about, well, what am I leaving behind in interacting with this technology? And that sort of leads to the second thing where I believe there's a lot of ground to be gained is how we inform ourselves, right? And this is where pure critical thinking is, I believe, crucial. And what I think will be one of the most significant skills of the next decade, certainly, and possibly beyond that. It's no longer the sort of like term in vogue, but this is why I believe it is actually crucially important to continue calling these systems, these machine learning systems and generative AI and all of them, they are automated decision makers, right? They make decisions based on the most probable, like they make that based on probability and what is most probably the correct answer. That's true for if you have an AI that regulates temperature in a factory. And it also is true for if you have an AI that's generating the next word or the next pixel in an image. It's all based on probability. So ultimately, it's just decision-making based on probability, which is why if you only go by probability, you're just converging upon like the average, which is why specificity is such a challenge. So if we position ourselves as using tools like that, one of the most important things that we need to do to continue being critical users is to think about where we are getting our information and who and what is doing the curation of that information for us, right? It used to be the case, if you studied English literature, right, you just read the entire English literature canon, which, let's be clear, is also a selection and also a very biased one. Absolutely. Yes. But then you just read all of it. And that's kind of that, right? And we find ourselves today in an information landscape, certainly growing up today in an information landscape where we are really only consuming a fraction of available information. Now, a lot of the information is currently of very poor quality, so that might be good. But if you consider that really we only have time and space to consume a fraction of information, then the selection of that information becomes 1,000-fold more important, right? And this is where I think one of the biggest risks is if we let algorithms make that decision for us. To give a really concrete example, if you read the news and you read it on the internet and you let an algorithm sort of like make a news feed for you, be that Google News, be that even with a lot of the news platforms, right, just scrolling through the feed, then it is giving you what it thinks is most likely to get the result it wants, right? On Facebook, for example, or on social media, the result these feed optimization algorithms are going for is often engagement. So that could be that you click on something, that you share it, that you like it, whatever. On many other news feeds, it's that you continue reading. And so these algorithms have this perverse incentive that doesn't align. In no case is it ever to inform you best, right? It's always to provoke some sort of reaction. So what I do personally, and what I think is something we should all be thinking about, is I read the newspaper in its newspaper form, right? Digitally, because I don't need a paper newspaper all the time. But that way, I know for a fact that I'm encountering things that would never be algorithmically recommended to me.
Because at least less so, Alex, because I'm a subscriber to The Guardian and The Economist Weekly in paper form, because I agree with you. And I in a way, have stopped reading the news for the very reasons you're explaining.
Exactly. And here's the thing. In that, I am placing my trust in the expertise of a group of humans, right? And I think that's the crucial difference. I am placing my trust. Now, those humans also have their own incentives, and it's not to say like, oh, they're just like these lofty goals, but at least their careers depend on them being good at precisely that curation of what is considered relevant information. And I would always say, like, read a number of different newspapers. The same with like, if you, I mean, with Spotify, for example, it's not that big of a deal, but of course, ultimately you're converging on more and more of the same, and you're less likely to encounter something that's unlikely.
No, it is a big deal, and it's a beautiful example. And, you know, the early days of Binova, when we started playing with GPT-2, we actually would recommend learning, depending on a skill level, but we would always throw in 1 or 2 wild cards. And the wild cards are fun, and they have to happen. So, you know, I see this huge kind of explosion of these tools and products that everybody's going to be forced in a way to use, right? I mean, we've got complete domination in the market with 4, 5, 6 big players. And then ultimately, hopefully, giving a lot of autonomy and power back to each individual country, community, and, you know, eventually at like a, who knows, a neighborhood level or a school level, right? And it's that would be really beautiful, but I could see that needing some time. So if we take this to and, you know, honestly, Alex, I am going to share these links to your work. You are so articulate, and it is only having, you know, your passion and your desire to be consistently involved in this field that I think makes you such a thought leader, specializing in AI, in ethics, but also just digital platforms and what they mean for our shaping societal structures. So if we think about that, we think about taking your expertise and making it really practical for school leaders, school decision makers. And when I say school, I mean, you know, school and university, and even potentially a learning department at a company. But what do you want them to know, Alex? What should they be super mindful of?
Well, I think one of the most interesting examples I saw coming out of like the rush last year, when sort of schools and education was flooded with AI generated texts and essays and etc., which you read 3 and you know exactly what you're looking at. I think one of the most compelling examples that I saw coming out of that was an educator. I believe this was secondary school. I think it would have been like 15-year-olds thereabouts, but I think you can do this at a younger age as well. They removed the essay requirements they had for testing, right? So no longer did students have to write essays. Instead, what they tasked them with was asking ChatGPT at the time to generate an essay, right? To doing the right prompts to get the essay out. But the assignment that they gave them was it had to then correct or edit what ChatGPT had written, improve it. I thought that was a really compelling way. This was early. This was like March of last year, when everyone was still sort of like scratching behind their ears, like, what are we going to do? Entire education systems have to be reformed because all of everything that we've given as assignments is suddenly doable by computers. I think that example, to me, what I liked about it is that it really shows that the critical thinking part is the part that the computers won't do. Doesn't matter that they don't, because that's what we're supposed to be good at. And what we're supposed to be getting better at anyways, is second these tools make their entrance. And so I found that to be a very compelling example, is to not say, oh, we shouldn't use these technologies, right? Because they're there and they're going to be a part of many of our professional futures, and they'll continue to develop anyways. And it would be silly at an educational level to just pretend they don't exist, which is what other people did, right? Other people at the time were like, oh, we'll make the essays a handwritten assignment that we do during class. And I was like, why would you do that? These technologies are right there waiting for us. So thinking critically about how can we teach, and I say children, but really I think some adults need more training in this than children do, who are often much more aware of some of the limitations of these technologies. How can we teach not to work against these technologies, but actually leverage them for us to become more critical thinkers, right? And asking ChatGPT to write an essay and then going in and saying like, here's why this is a good argument. Here's why this part is a bad argument. Here's why it needs more sort of like explanation on this. And here's some sources that I think would help for this. And you can do this in many different ways, right? It can be rhetorical. You can also look at it textual. I mean, the language that ChatGPT uses is so fluffy and just terrible. So even from a language comprehension point of view, you could give an assignment about like, okay, now rewrite this as if it wasn't written by ChatGPT, because we all recognize that language anyways. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to not just teach skills that we'll need in a world where these tools are available, but to also teach exactly around how to critically assess what these technologies can and cannot do, which will teach us a lot about the limitations that it has.
Absolutely. I think one of the, again, just very quickly, early days of Binova, we were asking questions, give me 4 or 5 examples from other sources, because you want to force the student to be able to still do that research. It's not going anywhere. But I do have to say, I like handwriting. I think handwriting forces us to connect with our brain and write out processes. And I think...
No, totally. I do all my reading preferably on paper too.
Same. So Alix, tell me, I'd love to just know from you, where do you see the biggest problem and where do you see the biggest opportunity for, you can speak to this, specifically to education if you're comfortable, or society, either way, your main 2 takeaways.
Biggest issue is, I think, well, I've covered a lot of that, but I think twofold. One is really that we approach whatever AI gives us as gospel, right? As just like universally applicable, universally true, and that we, in the process of doing that, lose some specificity. I work with a group out of Mexico who are working on capturing the wisdoms of some indigenous elders. A lot of that is oral tradition. So part of the whole practice of oral tradition is that it's oral so that it continues to evolve, right? Which runs directly counter to the way Western knowledge is captured, which is rigid, it's binary, it's digital. And so there's this great interest of like, can we even capture knowledge as it's preserved through oral tradition? Because it so fundamentally runs counter to the way that we're used to capturing knowledge, which is a really great reminder that that's just one system, one way of doing things. And just because it's become so proliferated doesn't mean it's the best way or that it's the only way. So I think that's a big risk. And the other big risk is really that we will just stop doing critical thinking, right? That we will outsource curating what information is relevant to us to a system that isn't optimized towards the same thing as we think it's optimized to, as in the case with news, where if I'm outsourcing the curation of relevant news articles to Google News, it is optimized to just keep me reading. Whereas if I do that to a group of journalists that write a newspaper together, they're incentivized predominantly, although also in other ways, to make sure that the things are covered, right, that need coverage. And so that's why I like newspapers over TV. The biggest opportunities, I think, are in finding ways to better represent what is and isn't present in datasets, or what can and cannot be done with AI. So right now, because of the race, because of this sort of like insane rat race that's happening in this area, everyone presents their AIs as if it can do everything, right? I think the biggest opportunity we have is there's a group that's They're called the data nutrition label. And their original inspiration was the actual food nutrition label, right? Just as you would, if you buy a jar of peanut butter, it says like, this is how much fat is in here. This is how much of that fat is saturated. This is how much sugar is in there. This is how much carbs, etc. If you want to do a fun deep dive, I actually really recommend the history of the food nutrition label is fascinating because it is itself a very striking example of industry standardization, right? Because of course, this had to be made. People had to decide on like, what do we measure? How do we measure? How do we represent it on these labels? And so that was the original inspiration for this group, the data nutrition label, because we don't have anything equivalent for data, right? This is what the sort of like representation in this data set is. This is, if we had that for the facial recognition software I mentioned, it would say, well, this data set is comprised of 80% white faces. If we had such a standardization for data sets, then we would have known beforehand, before even implementing this facial recognition software, we would have known like, well, there's an issue here, right?
We knew there was an issue. We knew there was an issue there, but now it's really in our face, so to speak, which I think you mentioned earlier, it was a good thing, which it is.
It's a great thing, right? Because it came to the fore. But if we knew there was an issue because the camera wasn't working properly, right? But if there was standardization on the data sets, then you would have known even before you would never train a facial recognition software on such a data set because it has like the equivalent of a ton of saturated fat and not enough fiber.
I love that we're getting into this because here's the thing, Alix, you and I might not, right?
Well, that's fair enough. But this again is what has really shifted in 2019, right? Is where before that, it really felt like screaming in the desert, like, hey, do we want to maybe care about representation in our data sets? I think this is really where we've seen some pivotal changes over the last couple of years. And I think they'll stick. And if they don't stick, I'll continue screaming in the desert. But so here is where I really think there's opportunities is to increase sort of like some standardization around data sets, which would increase transparency, right? Ultimately. And to say, this is an AI, it's a self-driving vehicle algorithm. It works well in Amsterdam. It doesn't work well in New Delhi. Like that we actually label all of our sort of like AI products in the way that we do our food, in the way that we do other things where it's just like, that's where I see a really big opportunity. I am expecting really that in the next 5 to 10 years, we will see industry leaders rewarded for that behavior if they do that well. I think there is a huge opportunity for people that are building AI, and that means everyone, right? Because everyone is now, but to lead by example and to set those standards, I think there's a lot of opportunity there that will translate into sort of like business opportunity, right? Because the person or whatever company figures out how to do this right, to be transparent about this, to be a leader in this space, I'll be years ahead of everyone else that's still trying to make universally applicable machines.
Oh, Alix, this is wonderful. What a fantastic way to leave us with food for thought on this, literally food for thought with the data nutrition label. I really like that. And I think that's promising. And I do hear optimism in you. I hope that that's a correct.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. I think there's plenty of opportunity. We just have to go and take it.
What can people do, if at all, to get in touch with you or to learn more about your work?
The easiest way to get in touch with me is on my LinkedIn. Just make sure if you do connect with me there that you mention where we met, even if it's through this, because that helps me understand. So connect with me on LinkedIn. It's also, I post some stuff about my work there as well. And that's a great way to keep in touch.
Wonderful. Alix, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing so much wisdom, so much of your research. You've been in this field for so long. You're an absolute pioneer in it. And I'm very grateful that you've shared your knowledge with our listeners today.
That's good. Thank you so much for having me, Jos.
Thanks, Alix. See you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Making Sense of AI. We hope you enjoyed listening and that it's given you valuable insights. A special thank you to our guest, Alix, for sharing her expertise and perspectives with us today. If you found today's discussion enlightening, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. This podcast was brought to you by Turner and Binova AI. To deploy AI at your business today, reach out now via the links in the description or directly on LinkedIn. Stay tuned for our next episode. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep on making sense of AI. Goodbye for now.